When Jonathan Roumie walked into the studio, he wasn't there to entertain. He came to tell the truth. Cold, quiet, undeniable truth. But Jimmy Kimmel wasn't ready for that. Not even close. In a matter of minutes, the jokes faded, the smirks died out, the rehearsed punchlines collapsed, and what followed left the studio in total silence. A buried contract, a quote Jimmy hoped had been long forgotten, and a question he refused to answer. This wasn't a debate, it was a leaf moral reckoning, and it was only just beginning. Stay with us, because what Jonathan revealed that night could rewrite everything you've been told for years. Jimmy Kimmel was in his element at first. He came prepared with sarcasm, ready to mock what he called Roumie's imaginary moral wall. He laughed, called it a fantasy, a performance meant only for religious fanatics and millionaires. The studio audience chuckled, the host nodded, and they moved to pivot. But then something shifted. Jonathan Roumie leaned forward. Until that moment, he hadn't said a word. He had just listened, attentively, silently, without interruption. Now, with the cameras locked on him, he raised a single finger, not to argue, to ask a question. "Mr. Kimmel, are you finished?" The room paused. Jimmy blinked, caught off guard by the calmness in Roumie's tone. "Sorry." It wasn't loud, it wasn't combative, but it landed like a hammer in a cathedral. What came next? It wasn't on the script. Roumie didn't argue, he didn't posture, he didn't shout. Instead, he opened a folder. Inside, an official report, pages of data from the Department of Homeland Security, stats from the Central Reserve Bank, state-by-state breakdowns showing how immigration reforms had reduced violence, relieved pressure on border towns, and returned jobs to struggling families. But then came the pivot, and it wasn't statistical. Jonathan didn't stop at numbers. He told a story, not about San Salvador, not about legislation, about a woman in El Paso, Texas. She had written to him. Her husband lost his factory job. Then the new reforms came. The job came back. So did his paycheck, and with it, his dignity. "This isn't just politics," she wrote. "It's like learning how to breathe again." The studio fell silent. Even the moderator, who had been trying to steer the conversation elsewhere, hesitated. "Mr. Kimmel," he asked, "do you have a response?" Jimmy opened his mouth, then closed it. The cameras caught everything. And here's the thing. No one in that studio knew that this, all of this, was just the beginning. Because beneath that heartfelt letter, tucked inside Roumie's folder, lay something no one expected. Not Jimmy, not the host, not even the producers. A document that would change everything once it hit the table. But we'll get there. For now, just know this. The moment Jonathan Roumie spoke, everything shifted. And by the end of that night, even the studio couldn't deny it. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. While Jimmy squirmed in his chair, trying to regain control, Jonathan opened the folder again. This time, he pulled out a document stamped with 3 words. Appropriations Committee Summary, white paper, black ink, a few red circles drawn by hand. But the words, they were thunder. Page 14, line 3, Roumie read, $1.6 billion allocated for border modernization under the 2019 bipartisan agreement. He looked up. "That project, Mr. Kimmel, you supported it." Jimmy flinched. Roumie turned to another page. Page 22, expanded migration operations, sanctuary jurisdictions federally funded, signed by 17 senators. The number hung in the air. 17. Jimmy tried to interrupt. Roumie didn't flinch. "You've called my position on immigration cruel," he said, his voice steady, "but you helped fund the very tools I used to carry it out." There it was, the contradiction. And it wasn't pulled from rumors or comment sections. It came straight from Jimmy's own voting record, his own public endorsements. The camera split them down the middle. One calm, one blinking, rattled. The moderator stepped in again. "Mr. Kimmel, would you like to clarify?" Jimmy answered, but the words came fast, nervous. "Well, those were negotiations. Context matters." Roumie didn't laugh, he didn't gloat. He simply nodded once and closed the folder. "Yes, context matters," he said, "especially when you've spent 4 years pretending this never happened." Silence again. But Roumie wasn't finished, not yet. He leaned back and told another story, this one about a police chief in southern Arizona who watched illegal crossings drop to their lowest in 30 years, whose department, after years of chaos, finally stabilized. "He wasn't from my party," Roumie said. "He wasn't from the opposition. He was just tired." He paused. "And tired," he repeated, "is how most people feel now. Tired of shouting, tired of spin, Tired of men in suits rewriting history just to win the next headline. The atmosphere changed. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning, but the hardest blow hadn't landed yet, because at the very bottom of Roumie's stack of documents, resting quietly on his lap, was one last file. Not a report, not a letter, a contract, signed, funded, hidden. And when that document hit the table, everything Jimmy had said would collapse. But that moment hadn't arrived. Not yet. Because before the final strike, Jonathan Roumie would do something else. Something Jimmy wouldn't see coming. He'd make it personal. Roumie turned to Jimmy, not with anger, not with scorn, with disappointment. "You've called my position cruelty," he said. "You've told millions I betrayed who we are." Then he reached into his jacket pocket, not the folder, and pulled out a small creased paper, worn at the corners, folded carefully. He unfolded it slowly and held it up. A quote from Jimmy Kimmel himself, dated 2009. "Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple. Those who enter the country illegally are breaking our laws. We must do everything we can to stop it." The studio air turned heavy. Roumie didn't raise his voice. He read it like a memory, one he wished still mattered. "You said that," he continued. "I was in college when I heard it, and I thought, finally, a man brave enough to say what's true." Jimmy tried to interject, but Roumie lifted his hand. "I'm not here to trap you in contradiction, Jimmy. I just want to ask you." He paused. "What changed?" Jimmy tried to interrupt, but Jonathan Roumie raised his hand gently. "I'm not here to trap you in a contradiction, Jimmy. I just want to ask, what changed?" Kimmel's lips pressed together. Roumie didn't back down. "Because the working families in San Bernardino haven't changed. The officers, the teachers, the mothers walking their children to school in unsafe neighborhoods. They still believe in what you said back then." He turned slightly, looking not at Jimmy, but directly into the camera. "And they deserve to know if you still believe it too." This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about trust. Jimmy leaned forward, eager to explain. He talked about demographic shifts, new humanitarian challenges, complex political realities, but every word he spoke sounded smaller than the sentence Roumie had just read aloud. "Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple." The broadcast caught everything. Viewers across the country watched as a narrative they'd accepted for years began to visibly crack in real time. Then Jonathan said something unexpected. "I'm not here to defend every tweet or every phrase from every speech." He paused. "But I will defend one thing, the right of Americans to know where their leaders really stand." He carefully refolded the paper and placed it gently on the table between them. "This isn't just about immigration," he said softly. "It's about whether your words still mean anything once you gain power." And that's when Jimmy Kimmel realized this wasn't a debate. It was a mirror, and there was no way to look away. But Roumie wasn't finished. Now came the part that would shake the room. He lowered his hand and pulled out one last file. It wasn't thick, just a few stapled pages. No redactions, no legal jargon, just the truth, simple and stark. Holding it up, he said calmly, "This is the contract Mr. Kimmel personally supported." Jimmy shifted in his chair again, but said nothing. Then Roumie read the line that froze the room. Section 2.83, emergency shelter allocations under subsection B may be applied to any individual, regardless of citizenship or immigration status. He looked up. "Mr. Kimmel, do you know how many American veterans were denied housing support that same year?" Jimmy didn't answer. "More than 400, Roumie continued. He didn't shout, he didn't scold, he just let the number speak. "You made a decision," he said. "You did it quietly. No press conference, no letter to the families who watched their loved ones sleep in cars. You buried it and moved on." The moderator stepped in. "Mr. Kimmel, would you like to respond?" Jimmy did, but his words came slow, halting. "That provision was part of a larger compromise. At the time, we were facing multiple crises. There were no easy choices." Roumie nodded gently. "There never are," he replied. "But leadership means choosing difficult truths over convenient lies." He placed the file down between them. "Families like mine aren't extremists for wanting their leaders to put them first." The audience remained silent for nearly 2 minutes, then slowly in applause. A few gasps, and astonished faces struggling to process what they just heard. Cameramen whispered. Producers backstage scrambled to rewrite the script. This wasn't the interview they expected, but somehow it was exactly what needed to happen. And yet, it still wasn't over, because now the conversation was shifting. Not just about what Jimmy had done, but why he'd done it. Roumie paused. Every document was already on the table. The reports, the quotes, the contract. There was nothing left to pull from a folder. What came next would come from the people watching. "I want to ask you something," Roumie said quietly. The studio leaned forward. "Do you believe Americans should come first?" Jimmy blinked. "What kind of question is that?" "It's a simple one," Roumie replied, "because every budget, every vote, every compromise we've talked about tonight comes down to that one question." He asked again, slower, firmer. "Do you believe Americans should come first?" Jimmy leaned back. "I believe in compassion," he said. "I believe we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can help those fleeing danger and still support Americans." Roumie didn't interrupt. He nodded, waited, and then answered for him. "But when the choice was between a veteran sleeping on the street and a non-citizen crossing the border, you chose the latter. When it was time to fund American schools or relocate new arrivals, you chose the latter. When you had to protect working-class wages or flood the labor market, you chose the latter." The silence in the studio was no longer uncomfortable. It was heavy. "You don't need to say it, Jimmy," Roumie added, "because your record already has." Jimmy tried again. "That's not fair. These issues are complex, nuanced. But the consequences," Roumie cut in, "are real. They're in the price at the grocery store, in the hospital wait lines, in neighborhoods that feel less safe, less familiar, every single day." The moderator glanced down at his notes. Nothing written there could salvage the moment. Roumie leaned forward, eyes on the audience now. "This isn't about hate. It's about priorities, about leaders who've forgotten who they serve." And then quietly, "I believe Americans come first. I always have, and I always will. No political trend, no donor, no headline will change that." Jimmy stayed silent because there was no good answer. The question had landed, and its echo was louder than anything said that night. But Jonathan Roumie wasn't done. Not yet. Because now he was going to close the circle with one final story, one that would explain why this night was never about politics, but something deeply personal. "You only come to places like that every few years," Roumie said quietly, eyes locked on Jimmy Kimmel, "right before an election." Jimmy shifted, visibly uncomfortable, but he didn't respond. Roumie continued, "My mother wasn't a policy expert. She was a nursing assistant, and she battled addiction. I was raised by my grandparents. My grandfather worked in a factory until the day it shut down. After that, everything got harder. The neighborhood shrank, the opportunities vanished." He paused, letting the silence stretch across the room. "Yes, politicians talked about justice, about equality, about the future, but they never talked about us. They didn't show up when the factory closed. They didn't call when the pharmacy disappeared. They didn't return when the overdoses began." Now he turned, not to Jimmy, not to the host, but to the people watching. "I remember sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table, watching the news, listening to men like Jimmy Kimmel talk about justice and reform while the people I loved were drowning." He looked down for a moment and then lifted his eyes again. "I didn't come here tonight to score points. I came because I remember what it feels like to be invisible. I remember what it's like to feel like no one in LA or Washington or anywhere with a spotlight cares if your father has a bulb or your child has heat in winter." Roumie leaned forward again. "And I know for a fact that millions of Americans feel that way right now." He turned slowly back to Jimmy. "You sit here and act like this is all about slogans, but for people out there," he motioned softly toward the unseen audience, "this is about survival." There was a long pause. "When you redirected those resources, when you mocked the border plan as a fantasy, when you claimed to stand with working people," Roumie let the moment hang. "You weren't just wrong, Jimmy. You weren't honest. And the worst part? You did it with a smile." Jimmy opened his mouth, but Roumie raised his hand calmly. "I don't want an apology. I just want you to stop pretending." The studio froze, because this was no longer a conversation between two men. This was between two Americas, one remembered and one forgotten. And Jonathan Roumie had one last card to play, one that went beyond facts and applause. And then, the moment, the reaction no one had planned for. At first, just a murmur, a few people at the back, a nod, a whisper, "He's right." Then slowly, applause, not wild, not forced, but real. The host looked nervously off camera. Producers in the control room panicked. This was supposed to be Jimmy's turf, a safe zone with soft questions and managed flow. But something had cracked, because the audience, both in studio and at home, wasn't reacting to performance. They were reacting to something they hadn't heard in a long time. Truth. Jonathan Roumie didn't bask in the moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't punch the air. He just sat silently and watched. A woman in the front row stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't hold a sign. She simply said, "Thank you," and sat back down. The cameras caught it. The internet noticed immediately. Before the show even ended, clips began to spread. Headlines followed. Roumie shifts the narrative live. Kimmel silent as Roumie unveils explosive documents. The hero came from where no one expected. But inside the studio, the moment still hadn't passed. Jimmy tried to recover. He spoke of unity, of the complexity of politics, of his years of experience. But it didn't matter. The room had already moved on. The host leaned in. "Mr. Roumie, one final comment?" Roumie didn't hesitate. "I think people are tired of being told they are the problem. Tired of hearing that their concerns are outdated. Tired of being treated as if wanting security, stability, and sovereignty is somehow wrong." He paused. "It's not wrong, they've just been ignored." And then something rare happened. Several studio staff, off camera, began to applaud. That moment wasn't a victory, it was a turning point. The old media choreography, the over-rehearsed talking points, had collapsed. Because that night, someone had broken through the wall. But Jonathan Roumie wasn't finished. As he stepped off the stage, a journalist rushed to him. "Mr. Roumie, why tonight? Why reveal all this now?" The studio returned to its usual pace. Papers shuffled, cameras repositioned, the next guest prepped. But something had changed. Jimmy Kimmel exited quickly, surrounded by handlers, offering no comment, no press follow-up, no attempt to spin the outcome. Jonathan Roumie, by contrast, took his time. No theatrics, no gloating. He shook hands, thanked those who had truly listened. Another reporter approached. "Mr. Roumie, why tonight? Why bring the truth forward now?" Roumie looked him in the eye and answered without hesitation. "Because truth doesn't wait for the perfect moment. And I'm done asking for permission." That was it. No flourish, no performance. But by midnight, that sentence was everywhere. "I'm done asking for permission." It hit Twitter first, then YouTube, then national headlines. Pundits debated whether it was a political move or a personal stance. But to the millions watching from home, it didn't matter. It felt real, because it was real. In towns across the country, radio hosts, city councils, Facebook groups all echoed it. Even those who didn't like Roumie admitted, "He spoke for me tonight." It wasn't strategy, it was resonance. And Roumie didn't slip backstage to celebrate. No tie, no teleprompter. He walked out into the cool night air, just a man who had said what needed to be said. An aide approached with a phone. "Mr. Roumie, the governor wants to speak with you." He smiled softly. "Tell him I'll call tomorrow," he said. "There'll be time for politics." Because that night was not about politics. It was about clarity. It was about truth. And it was about the rare gravity of something genuine. Because the real surprise wasn't that Roumie challenged Jimmy Kimmel. The real surprise was that he did it without shouting, without backing down, and without losing the people. And that changed everything. Jonathan Roumie had walked off that stage without raising his voice, without asking for applause, and without losing the support of the people. But one knot remained untied. A quiet detail Jonathan hadn't mentioned live. Not because it wasn't important, but because he didn't have to. It was buried deep, in the fine print of a contract no one had bothered to read on camera. But once discovered, it wouldn't just unravel the debate. It could change Jimmy Kimmel's entire career. Across the country, the fallout from the broadcast was everywhere. Clips flooded social media. Roumie was no longer just a guest. He was a national conversation. But behind the cameras, in a quiet office in Pasadena, a civil servant began combing through the documents Roumie had shared. Not the headlines, not the quotes or the numbers, but the details. And there it was. NXD, a small paragraph tucked at the end of the emergency housing contract, a clause easy to overlook. It referenced an unnamed contractor, services provided by the Metropolitan Community Initiatives Network, MCIN. The name rang a bell, so he looked again, then cross-referenced it with political donation records. And his stomach dropped. MCIN wasn't just any vendor. In the last 6 years, it had received over $47 million in federal funds, funneled directly from Jimmy Kimmel's affiliated foundation network. And worse, internal audits had flagged them repeatedly for sloppy distributions and suspicious hiring practices. But the final blow? The chair of MCIN's board was the husband of one of Kimmel's top political donors. Everything was there, black and white, signed, approved, renewed year after year. And Roumie had left it all in the folder he handed to the studio, untouched, unedited. The production crew had missed it. But now, journalists were catching up. The first post appeared quietly on an audit blog. Then it spread to regional outlets. Then to national news. Jimmy Kimmel linked to shelter contract under federal investigation. Scandal in emergency housing program rocks late-night anchor's legacy. Roumie, for his part, said nothing. He didn't need to. When asked if he had planned the revelation, he simply answered, "I brought the truth. It's not up to me what people do with it." But everyone knew what was coming. Investigations, congressional hearings, a long, messy reckoning, and possibly more. Because if the public kept asking questions, this wouldn't just end in embarrassment, it could end in resignation. 3 days later, Jonathan Roumie stood on a stage once again. But this time it wasn't CNN. No makeup room, no lights, no suits. It was a folding chair in a crowded municipal hall with working hands, paper coffee cups, and voices that didn't belong to producers, but to the people. The room was full, everyone had heard. Roumie stepped to the microphone. He didn't begin with politics. He didn't even mention Jimmy Kimmel. He began with a pause, a long one. Then he said, "Sometimes a moment comes when all the masks fall." The room went still. What you saw on that stage wasn't about Jimmy, and it wasn't about me. It was about what happens when power forgets who it serves. He let that settle. And for the first time in years, truth spoke louder than branding. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. A man in boots nodded slowly. "I'm not here to celebrate," Roumie said. "I'm here to ask, what do we do now?" He took a step forward. That subcontract was no accident. It was a system, a machine that feeds itself and calls you selfish for asking where your tax dollars go. There were scattered claps. They call it mercy. They call it progress. But ask yourself, why do you have less in your pocket? Why are the wait lines longer? Why are the services worse? The room was silent again. They tell us Americans can't be a priority, but when it's time to send billions abroad or provide shelters to those who arrived yesterday, they never hesitate. Roumie stepped forward. They've forgotten who they serve, but we haven't. There was no rage in the room, only clarity. This wasn't a debate. It was a line in the sand, and Jonathan Roumie knew it. We need leaders willing to speak truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs them, even when a network is standing by, waiting to rip them apart live. He scanned the room. "I don't care what party you're from. If you're tired of the lies, it's time." Then he reached into his coat and slowly lifted the same folded note he had read during the broadcast. "Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple." He paused, then added his own words. "And staying silent in the face of truth is betrayal." The room rose in a standing ovation. Outside, reporters waited. But Roumie didn't rush. He shook hands, listened to stories, promised to carry them forward, because this was never about media. It was the beginning of something deeper. And far across town, in a private conference room at ABC headquarters, Jimmy Kimmel finally understood. This hadn't been a lost argument. It had been something much bigger, something he could no longer control. If this moment moved you, if something in Jonathan's words resonated deeper than politics, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that challenge the narrative, uncover the truth, and speak for the forgotten. Your voice matters, and so does the truth. Hit that subscribe button and join a community where integrity still has a voice. Thank you for watching and for listening.